incentive for projects to try to like do really loud marketing and try to like basically become part-time politicians and convince everyone that hey, like like my thing deserves a lot of money, right? So these are a couple of challenges. So here I'm going to suggest a few principles for designing governance in a way that avoids some of these issues, right? And some of these things I think are like a bit controversial because they kind of go against some previous principles, right? So one is explicit mission focus over both indefinite public good focus and over token holder value focus, right? So with if you look at quadratic funding, right, this is one of those examples, right? Quadratic funding, the core idea of it was that basically was trying to emergently discover which things are public goods by saying, well, the things that people donate to are the public goods, right? Because if a bunch of different people are willing to donate to it, that means that they all benefit from it, and so, you know, if you donate, then it's good, then that's a signal that it's good, and if many different people donate, that's a signal that it's a public good. Now, quadratic funding is like maximally unopinionated, right? Quadratic funding inside of the mechanism does not have any kind of assumptions whatsoever beyond basically one, all participants are equal, and two, like that actually that the participants don't have like a lot of cross relationships with each other. And that second assumption is false, and that actually creates a lot of problems, right? But in general, like quadratic funding, it doesn't care about open source versus closed source. It doesn't care about Ethereum versus Bitcoin. It doesn't care about Ethereum versus funding the NSA. Basically, it's kind of maximally unopinionated, right? And the challenge is that being maximally unopinionated is like actually very capital inefficient, right? If you were the UN and you had some kind of exceptional mandate where, like, for example, imagine we have some great moment in history where we decide that we need funding to support global public goods, and at the same time we realize that, like, hey, Antarctica has a lot of resources, then like maybe there's like a global mandate to like harbor tax auction Antarctica and then put the revenue into a quadratic funding gadget, right? And then like being maximally unopinionated and just saying we support global public goods might be the way to maximize legitimacy, right? But here, if we say, like, if you just have like $5 billion and like actually, you do care about particular goals, and like actually you would feel sad if your thing ended up subsidizing Twitter trolls or ended up subsidizing closed source stuff, then like you should just stick your mission into the thing, right? Second is deliberate indirection, right? So I think like for a long time, democratic philosophy, maybe for the last couple of decades, it's had this idea that the theoretical ideal is direct democracy and indirection is just an efficiency device, like it's only there to solve the problem that people don't have attention for everything. And here I would argue that like actually like basically like more like forced indirection is a good thing for other reasons. And also pluralism, so in some cases maximizing distance between participants and giving higher weight to agreeing votes from actors who normally disagree. So this is also different from traditional democracy that basically just does vote counting, right? So the idea is, if in this room we have, let's say 200 people, and then let's say we're voting on the location of the next ETH Dublin, and then you have 105 people voting for one thing, 95 people voting for the other thing, but it turns out that the first 105 people are like all slavish followers of 0x influencer dog on Twitter, and that's where they get all their information, right? And then the other 95 are like actually diverse and they live in 95 different countries, right? Probably the correct answer would actually be to go with the 95, right? Because even though it's fewer people, like it actually represents more signals, right? So, like trying to so the reasons for the second and the third are basically capture resistance, right? And like capture resistance can be explicit, so like bribery, multi-account ownership. It can also be implicit, like shared memes, everyone following 0x influencer dog on Twitter. So this is a two-layer design that I want to propose. Basically, imagine if you have like separation between a preference elicitation gadget, whose goal is to like basically represent the mission, and then you also have a decision-making gadget. Now, the decision-making gadget can be centralized, can be decentralized, it can be pluralistic. So over here, you have like you could have like a CEO, and then you could also separately have a couple of mini CEOs for some mini initiatives. If you want, you could just have one CEO. If you want, you could get rid of the CEO, which would actually make sense for like funding, right? Because funding is one of these like very concave problems. For running an Oracle, you also don't want a CEO. The decision-making gadget is accountable to the preference elicitation layer, which basically means that you want some feedback mechanism by which, if the decision-making gadget does things that go against what the preference elicitation layer wants, then like it gets penalized or it gets removed somehow. And the preference elicitation gadget is like the the unincentivized incentivizer, and it's accountable to no one. And like it has to be, because the accountability chain has to like stop somewhere. There has to be something at the top of the chain. And here instead we're going to say we protect it from capture by maximizing distance, right? So we say ideally the only thing the members in this group have is their belief in the mission, right? Ideally they would not talk to each other and disagree with each other as much as possible on other types of issues, and so you actually get like both different perspectives, and you also minimize the risk that the preference elicitation layer starts to become like loyal to itself instead of being loyal to the mission, right? Because that's always the biggest risk. So this is like one way to like think about how to do these things. So what kinds of technologies might we use, right? So privacy and governance is one. So voting should be ZK. And longer term, there's also MACI, which basically makes your voting unprovable, which makes like bribery attacks even harder. So that's one. Technology two is AI, right? And I think the next wave of DAOs has to use AI. The next wave of governance has to use AI. I think like at this point, anything new that does not take AI seriously will just get outcompeted by something that does. And to me, the biggest risk is basically that like we don't figure out the decentralized version of this, and people will instead use the centralized version of that. And the centralized version basically says, well, let's just like put like GPT in the middle, and then let's give GPT a prompt. Like maybe let's vote on the prompt, but generally GPT just does everything, right? And so if we do that, then like you're not actually being decentralized. So what are the benefits of AI, right? AI can resolve decision fatigue. And so the idea basically is that instead of each participant having to give a huge number of answers, or each participant having to delegate the 0x influencer dog, each participant can give like a few bits of input to a mechanism, and then that few bits of input is enough to learn their preferences, and then based off of that, like you have some other gadget that's optimizing for it, right? And like deep funding and futarchy are kind of two very natural examples of trying to do this kind of thing, right? So the way deep funding works is basically a jury answers a small number of questions that are randomly sampled, and then you have like basically anyone can use AI models to try to submit answers for everything else, for all of the other questions. And then those models get scored and get selected based on how well they conform to the jury answers on that small subset of the questions where the jury actually has to answer things. And then futarchy is basically the jury decides what the objective function is, and then basically decisions get made by a prediction market on the objective function, and then the accountability basically comes because the people betting on the prediction market, they eventually get either rewarded or penalized based on like whether they were right or wrong about what impact their decision would have on the objective. So here, one thing that you might notice is that like you are actually also introducing indirection, right? And the reason indirection is valuable here is basically like indirection can really like it can minimize like a lot of like specific capture risks, right? So with public goods funding, for example, like imagine there is one decision, and that one decision is like, hey, let's give like a Viper $500,000, and then you are one of the decision makers, and then it turns out that like, hey, actually, like Viper is your brother's project, and like, you know, you're really, right? So the worst case outcome is, of course, if you know, you as an individual have like a unilateral right to just decide whether to give the money to Viper or someone else, right? And so the next best thing is, well, we can do a median of a few different people, and that's kind of like a forcible smoothing mechanism. And then if we take this